and have a general idea of phosphorus issues. But I think the thing that for me was surprising, I didn't realize until I came over from Purdue Farms, how inefficient phosphorus use really is. So essentially, you apply a fertilizer, MAP or DAP, of that fertilizer placed, only 10 to 20% of it makes it to the plant in that growing season. And there's multiple peer-reviewed studies out there that essentially validate this, mainly because the MAP or DAP goes into solution, gets into the soil profile, the soil grabs that phosphorus and doesn't release it, and you have a small amount of that P fertilizer that actually makes it to the plant. On the global impact side, as I mentioned, it's inefficient, but you also have the loss of that phosphorus to the waterways. So USGS has the Sparrow model. You take an average of chemical phosphorus fertilizer loss across the United States, and it's about 6% of P applied is lost to the water resource. So you have a farmer paying to put the phosphorus into his or her bank, and hope that it gets to the plant at some point over the life within their soil profile. And actually, every year they're getting a 6% loss of that phosphorus. There's also the carbon emissions related to that product. And then finally, it's not like nitrogen where you have an unlimited amount in the air that you could transition into a fertilizer product. It's a finite resource that we get from rock. And that rock, although there is a large reserve still left, I think about 76% of it is in Morocco. And in the United States, we probably have about 50 years left of our phosphorus reserve, and then it's going to be similar to the oil market where we're going to have to go elsewhere to get our product to feed our crops. Brian, you want to go ahead and cover the agronomic challenge?
Yes, thank you. So to go a little bit deeper into this, as we look at the agronomic challenges that we have and experience with conventional phosphate sources, we know that these materials very quickly react in the soil, as Steve alluded to, with upwards of 90% of what we apply becoming tied up in things like organic matter and binding up the soil particles, and with reactions to calcium, iron, aluminum, magnesium, just to name a few. And that's largely dependent on pH of the soils. And when this occurs, this results in very little plant available P, go ahead and advance, available to the crop for the rest of the season. So what we should all know as field experienced people working with growers is that phosphorus is either going to be mineralized or immobilized in soil solution. And that's what this graph shows here. We have an extensive amount of fixed pool phosphorus that is very, very slowly available to the crops in subsequent years over time. And once phosphorus is fixed in that soil, it becomes very, very difficult for it to be made plant available in future years. Natural soil cycling of phosphorus does occur, but what we also know, and what I have seen extensively across over North America during my career, is that cycling and P availability, the soluble pool of phosphorus in our soils, is very, very slow to cycle through and become available to our crops. And all of our crops are growing at a much faster rate than our soil's ability to mineralize and release and make available. Next slide. Go ahead, Steve.
It's taking a little bit there, sorry.
No worries. So just a quick recap on phosphorus. As phosphorus availability depends on the soil's ability to release phosphorus in the soil solution. Go ahead and go forward. And it depends on the root's availability to intercept phosphorus. We should all know that phosphorus is very, very immobile in the soil. It does not move very much. And there's really only three ways. Go ahead and advance. Three ways that phosphorus moves from the surface to the surface root of the soil. From the soil to the root surface where it can actually take it up. The first one's root interception. And the reality of it is the phosphorus products that we're applying today through MAP and DAP, you actually have to have almost direct contact with that root to go by a phosphorus prill that's been melted down in phosphorus to release for it to be taken up. The vast majority of phosphorus is moving through mass flow and diffusion, where upwards of 95% of our phosphorus use efficiency that's coming from the soil is from that available pool being moved to the soil soluble pool for plant uptake. So without, number one, an adequate source of phosphorus in the soil available pool, soluble pool, you're not going to have efficient uptake of phosphorus through that mechanism. And traditional forms of phosphate, as we should get into here a little bit later, are highly reactive to the soil through a moisture gradient that causes that chemical reaction and that magnetic bonding of calcium and phosphorus, for example, or iron and aluminum. Go ahead. So the way that we currently manage phosphate is really not efficient, or is it sustainable, as Steve was mentioning. We see this all over the country and frankly all over the world. And we in North American agriculture are generally pretty progressive, but
the 5th through the 11th, I think, but yes.
Forms of phosphorus through MAP and DAP that were really developed way back in the late 50s and early 60s. So 10 to 30% of the MAP or DAP that we apply as phosphate is only available in 1 year. And after that, it becomes slowly available over time. And it can take as much as 9 to 14 or 15 years to recover any value from what we like to call banking or building our soil P levels. There's enough peer-reviewed articles out there that have been written that very much suggest that. And there is one that I have read that's out of Ohio State University, where as much as about 12 years after applying phosphorus, or in a zero applied phosphorus at a average rate of say 20 parts per million, it took 14 years for that to be drawn down to critical levels. So we see that the management challenges that we have with phosphorus and being able to not only supply enough for the current year's crop growth and the yield expectations we have, the balance of what we don't get up to 90% in the soil is tied up and very rarely available as time goes on. Next slide. So a lot of us have seen pictures like this over the course of our careers. And as we take a look at phosphorus uptake, and the mindset that we all have in the field is that we put phosphorus down, we put MAP or DAP down, we put 1034 polyphosphates down in the spring with the idea of establishing early crop establishment for strength and root structure and so forth. While that's important, yes, but have we really ever considered the value that phosphorus brings much later in the season towards crop production? As noted here in the slide, the vast majority of phosphorus requirements that go to the grain, upwards of 75% of the corn availability or corn's usage of phosphorus happens when that crop switches from vegetative to reproduction. So if we start early, that's great, but if we don't have sufficient phosphorus resources in that soil pool, moving us later into the season, we can and generally will see not a negative yield effect, but we're only going to get what the soil is able to supply later on in the season. Next slide. Same thing for soybeans. As we take a look at soybeans, when we get into the reproductive stages of growth for soybeans, that is where the plant demand for phosphorus really begins to skyrocket for not only continued bloom, early pod set and development, and then ultimately pod fill. So when we get into the latter stages of the season, and that's why generally we see an uptick in our yields when we get some good rains in late July through mid-late August timeframes, primarily because when we get those rains, that allows the soil to have enough moisture in it to be able to release some of those phosphorus sources that are in the soil for the beans to recover and mineralize, take up into the crop and apply to the beans. And what we're going to show you here in a little bit is how Rhizosorb can help improve that process much later in the season to provide those phosphorus resources during reproductive growth. Go ahead.
So we covered what the problem is, and now we're going to cover Phospholutions and the Rhizosorb technology. So our purpose is enhancing global phosphorus use. Our values, mindful, original, bold, but I think the big thing, the belief at Phospholutions, we believe sustainable and responsible production of phosphorus is fundamental for mainly getting the farmer to be more profitable and growing the crop we need. That's number one. Number two, increasing the effectiveness of P2O5. And I think this is, we'll cover at length here in this section. Helping meet global food demand. And on my side of the coin, the less environmental impact is a big positive with it. And then lower cost phosphorus production and actually making the retailer more profitable. So some history on Phospholutions. So it's hard to believe, but I got my BS from Penn State in 1991, and that's when Dr. Jonathan Lynch started studying our technology. Dr. Lynch is a world-renowned plant scientist at Penn State, just retired about a month ago. He studied the technology for about 25 years. Our CEO and founder, Hunter Swisher, had Dr. Lynch for a plant science course, and Dr. Lynch spoke about the technology and how it can deliver phosphorus to the plant more efficiently. And Hunter raised his hand and said, well, what are you doing with it? And Dr. Lynch said, look, I would love to commercialize it, but I'm a full-time professor. I don't have the time to do this. Hunter went to the Penn State IP office and licensed to the patents from Penn State and started Phospholutions in 2016. From there, initially started in the turf arena and then moved to ag. In 2021 was when we really started doing more on-farm trials, large farm trials, and that's when I started with the company also. And then 2023 was when we launched our 839-0 focused fertilizer product for large row crop ag. So this kind of covers the value chain and why we think our product is a great product for all the people in the value chain. One, it's preserving yields. The big thing with our product is we've shown on large farm trials that you can put 50% less P2O5 compared to a MAP product and get the same yield. This ends up being a $20 per acre ROI back to the farmer. On the sustainability side, you have lowered greenhouse gas emissions by 45% and lower runoff potential by 78%. There's a higher profitability for the retailer and for producers, and it's scalable and easy to use. So essentially, when we designed the product, the end product for ag, we made sure it was essentially the same as the current dry MAP DAP fertilizer products, so there's not new equipment needed. And then also we can inject our active ingredient into the fertilizer production process. So essentially making it very easy to implement our product in the current MAP and DAP facilities across the globe. So what is the technology? So it's a proprietary mix of metal oxides. Rhizosorb's porous nature, surface area, and positive charge allow it to act as basically an anionic sponge. Absorbing negatively charged P2O5. Now, the soil does the same thing. The biggest positive with our product is it also desorbs phosphorus easily. So it's weakly bound phosphorus in comparison to a lot of the soil profiles. You'll have a strongly bound phosphorus that's not released at a intensity high enough to feed the plant over the growing season. So the mode of action enables phosphate to be released and increase plant available phosphorus. Again, mode of action, absorption and desorption of phosphorus. I think the thing I really want to impress upon everyone is the way we currently use phosphorus, we put it on the soil, we expect the soil to adsorb it, we put it in our bank, and then we expect it to desorb. And that's where the problem is pretty evident with the 10 to 20% of the MAP DAP is actually used by a plant in that growing season. So the reason we can place 50% less P2O5 is because our product desorbs that phosphorus when the plant needs it. So you see the forces of adsorption on the left, or on the right-hand side. But the big thing to take away from this slide, Rhizosorb increases the phosphorus absorptive capacity of the soil. There we go. As I said, I was afraid that was going to happen. Wasn't going, and then I was afraid it was going to double ahead. So anyway, as I said previously, our product is embedded directly into the production of conventional fertilizer, increases absorptive capacity, allowing the phosphorus to be absorbed and desorbed more readily. And it's a proprietary plant-driven release based on chemical gradients. So essentially, as the phosphorus is taken from the plant out of the soil water complex, our product will release phosphorus back into that soil water complex at a much faster rate than a soil profile would from the soil bank. Increasing nutrient uptake. I think the big thing to take away from this slide really is the fact no matter the P in your soil, our product works. Some of the concern we had initially when we brought the product out was, hey, will it work in low P soils? Because if you're reducing the phosphorus by 50%, will the plant have sufficient P? And what we actually see in this graph in the upper right is that's one of the better locations where we actually meet or exceed the grower standard practice. So all of these are in comparison to MAP placed at a grower standard practice. So if the farmer gets a soil test and it says you need 100 pounds of MAP, we will place our product at a 50% P2O5 rate in comparison to that. And what you see is at low P, at optimal P, and in high P soils, we meet or exceed the grower standard practice in that plot. Ryan, you want to take it from here?
Yeah, so digging a little bit deeper into our history from commercialization and trials. So Steve was mentioning that our trials really began back in 2019 through 2023. And by the time we get through the end of this year and I have all the data collected back, we will have actually over 600 trials over the last 5 years across a pretty wide footprint that we'll demonstrate in a minute. So everything from lab assays to large acre grower trials. And one of the things that we believe, that I personally believe is important, is that we are able to take and evaluate at field scale situations. CROs and small plots tell us one set of data by specific questions. The field testing helps us as a field agronomist and consultants and specialists in soil fertility, gives us the idea picture to answer the questions at field scale that we might have for phosphorus use efficiency and also what the growers might have. So what you see here is a clear depiction of the range of studies that we have gone through in order to validate the scientific successes and claims that began back in the early 90s. But so looking more specifically at Penn State, multi-state phosphate study that has been performed from 19 through 22. In fact, I think some of this is still going on. Let's focus on the centerpiece of the slide right now. And what Steve is really talking about and how we're able to accomplish the same relative field standards as a grower standard practice, we are measuring it by how much phosphorus is being moved into the plant. So by looking at a year-over-year phosphorus tissue tests, we are noting and seeing a statistical equality of rhizosorbs, phosphorus material, and active ingredient being able to be processed into the plant and represented into the plant tissue analysis, as noted on the screen. So you see year over year, no statistical difference between the phosphorus tissue values showing up on a tissue test relative to a grower standard practice of whatever that might be. Taking that to the left side here, where we look at corresponding yield results year over year, we can also see a nice statistical equality in yields coming back out of these small plots, small plot replicated at Penn State, to further demonstrate that not only are we using less phosphorus applied to the soil relative to a grower standard practice, we are able to, because of what we recently talked about, being able to identify a higher soil solution value of phosphorus that is then being moved into the plant through that mass flow and diffusion. Somebody might ask on this call if you're really looking seriously at the data, and that's of concern to you. In 2020, every time I talk about this slide, I just pull this out to address it up front. 2020 in corn, you see a fairly low yield. In commercial standard practices, that's not acceptable to anybody. But however, any of you that were around and observant of what happened in 2020, I spent a lot of time on the East Coast and in the Northeast in 2020 on some other assignments, and it was very, very dry. So that is the reason why you see the yield impact not necessarily what we would expect from a commercial yield situation. And then going to the right side of the slide, in true PhD testing fashion, they always like to have a 0P applied or a zero application of anything. So that is what is represented there. And we know that when you, regardless of where your soil test P values are, we know that when you apply no P, you can have a deleterious yield effect. And then when you just apply a 50% rate to a grower standard practice of conventional MAP or DAP, you also see that you can have a relative yield impact, negative yield impact, versus a standard practice at 100%. And what Rhizosorb has been shown to do, as depicted by this graphical analysis here, is a 50% P2O5 reduction is actually maintaining in these small plot replicated research points, data points at Penn State, an equal standard to yield expectations under standard practices. Next slide. Taking this now to on-farm trials, each of these dots represents our footprint, as I like to call it, over the past 5 to 6 years now, over 16 states, and now we've got 5 years of data as data continues to come in from this year. In 2023, we tested Rhizosorb over at least 57 to 60 on-farm trials in independent locations where growers followed a standard of protocol to their relative practices. And what you see there are the data points. You can't really see it, but over in the Chesapeake Bay region, there are several dots over there. So we have been working on the East Coast as well to continue to prove out Rhizosorb's efficacy. Year over year corn results from 21 to 23 show, again, a positive yield improvement over a grower standard practice with a reduced rate of P2O5. And that's the key here. The thing that we all need to remember is that Rhizosorb 839O is an enhanced efficiency fertilizer that Steve will talk about here in a few minutes. But at the end of the day, it's phosphorus. MAP and DAP, 1846, 1152, are rock phosphate sources created into a fertilizer system. MAP is similar, except that it has this metal oxide blend to it that allows the continued adsorption and holding capacity for phosphorus to be held in soil available pool. Next slide. Digging a little deeper, what we have also begun to look at, because we get this question quite a bit around the country where we are talking to growers and retailers. So what happens if you're telling me and recommending that I use much less P2O5 than I'm normally used to using, We've actually studied this in plot-on-plot trials, and what you notice here is that throughout a 4-year period of these replicated studies, there has been no significant drawdown in soil test phosphorus that has been observed. This data represented on this slide here encompasses 32 site years of observations. And while we can see, and by the way, I'll just note here, in 2021, the beginning soil test phosphate value was 20.3 parts per million as measured on a Bray P1. And while there is a variability in soil testing that can happen year over year, if you went today and took a GPS reference point of soil, core soil today, and you went back to that same spot 1 year from now, more than likely those values would be slightly different. There's a lot of dependence and a variability in the way that we take our soil tests today. So suffice it to say that while variability in soil P testing can produce some year-to-year fluctuations, the average starting P was 20.3 in 21, and through this fall, we have seen that all these locations, the average soil test phosphorus value was 20. So there's no relative drawdown, mining of the soil, as the industry likes to call it, noted in our plot-on-plot trials after 4 years. And these are studies that we are continuing to look at. Just because we've got 4 years doesn't mean we're not going to stop this. We're going to continue this on, because at the end of the day, what we are really talking about is providing more P to the plant. And what I like to say, feeding the current crop, and managing our soils. So any of us that are heavily involved in soil testing and soil sampling, we're going to see the trends where you start to use Rhizosorb over time. And through this process of every 2, 3 or 4 years, on however you're doing your soil testing, your soil sampling, grid or otherwise, you'll be able to see those things and take appropriate steps to manage the soil for your soil test values. Next slide. In our small plot data, the total of 20 trials through 2023 is showing that nearly 100% of yield expectations relative to grower standard yields were met on corn with Rhizosorb over, what is that? That's 2, 4, 6 states for corn, and in Illinois for soybeans. A total of 20 trials demonstrating a significant positive impact to grower standard yields of what you would normally expect from a field average. Next. Rhizosorb trials at scale on the farm are very similar results to that of what we see in small plot replicated trials that we just showed on the previous slide. So as of the printing of this slide here from 2021 to 2023, 12 states for corn, 5 states for soybeans, and we've also been doing additional work in small grains, canola, pulse crops, as well as what we at Phospholutions continue to do is expand Rhizosorb's informational reach and field testing into other crops such as potatoes. We oftentimes get this too, when we should know that the efficiency of phosphorus is generally measured or as a direct function of soil pH. So the green line above the black line provides indication as a measurement of total biomass where Rhizosorb performs the best across a pH range. The black line is an indication of plant biomass relative to MAP or DAP applications across those same pH ranges. So what we notice is because of this adsorptive effect and the ability to provide phosphorus to the plant when the crop needs it, is demonstrating that Rhizosorb is very minimally, actually I'm going to say not affected by soil pH. In fact, your soil movement into the plant and into biomass is being shown at a greater rate where Rhizosorb is used across that pH range. Next. So kind of bringing this piece of it to a summary for me, we have taken everything that we've done so far and took average yields across all the states that you see highlighted there, and those are average yield representations on all of the trial sites that we have applied Rhizosorb at a 50% P2O5 reduction relative to grower standard practice across that footprint. Next. And looking at it side by side from a percent yield advantage on corn and the bushels per acre, you can note there that the positive impacts of Rhizosorb use across those weather patterns, cultural practices, soil types, and soil moisture conditions, we see that on the average, we are performing very, very well with a significant reduction, 50% reduction in P applied. And this is as I mentioned earlier, phosphorus is only going to get into the plant when there's adequate soil moisture to provide that movement, mineralization and movement into the crop. So obviously, the further west we go, I live in South Dakota, and when we get west of the Missouri River, some of our average tend to be much closer to the grower standard practice, primarily because we live in a drier environment. Let's see.
Okay, so covered the problem. We've gone through our technology and how it addresses the problem. And I'll talk to you about the sustainability and watershed impacts of using our product versus a MAP or DAP product. So on the sustainability impact, we've done a study in New Zealand on on the runoff potential of phosphorus with our product versus a MAP or DAP product, and we've reduced that by 78%. Through Dr. Lynch's studies on the leaching side of the equation. He actually had some studies showing up to like a 98% reduction of leaching. We used the 84%. I think that was the lowest number just to be conservative. We then conducted a life cycle assessment with a third party, and this is measured boundary-wise from mineral mine to farm gate. So essentially you're taking the phos acid or phos rock, making it phos acid, incorporating our product, making it overseas, shipping it back to the United States, placing it on a farm. And it's a 40% decrease in eutrophication, 45% reduction in CO2 emissions, decrease in freshwater aquatic ecotoxicity by 46%, and decrease in marine toxicity by 44%. On the carbon reduction side, again, 45.2% reduction compared to MAP. If you compare it to DAP, it's a much larger reduction because you've got much more ammonia in the DAP product. That would equate to about 3.4 million tons of CO2 per year if it was placed across all corn acres in the U.S. And to give a kind of a global view, if we replace all ammoniated phosphates across the globe with Rhizosorb product, that's about 39 million tons of CO2 per year, which is a pretty substantial amount of carbon emissions that we can reduce. To bring it back to the Chesapeake Bay and to our region, when I was at Purdue Farms, I dealt quite a bit with the Chesapeake Bay program, the Bay model, and actually using CAST, which is their model, and you can actually jump in and plug in your own scenario analysis. So I went through, looked at 2022, which was a ag census year, and 2025, and pulled out how much phosphorus was estimated to be lost by chemical fertilizer, which was 2.825 million pounds of P was lost in 2022. If 100% of the farmers that utilize chemical fertilizer in the Bay replaced it with Rhizosorb, that would only be 621,000 pounds lost. I think the bigger thing to look at here is, so the 2025 projections, the goal is 13.31 million pounds of P or less going to the Chesapeake Bay region. And if 100% of the farmers that utilize chemical fertilizer for their P transition to Rhizosorb today, we would meet the P goal for the entire Bay. So it's a pretty substantial reduction in phosphorus loss from just chemical fertilizer. So this doesn't, I'm not incorporating any manure acres here. This is just pea chemical fertilizer in the Bay Basin. On the EEF side of the equation, so this is a long process. We've gone through, we've gotten APCO tentatively approved our product as an enhanced efficiency fertilizer, also as our product as a beneficial substance. With this, US NRCS state agronomist Mark Goodson has approved Rhizosorb as an EEF in Pennsylvania. And with the land grant approval also, so Dr. White here at Penn State has approved us as an EEF and stated we meet all the criteria for it. I talked to Mark a couple weeks ago and the program coordinators, and they estimated that about a $45 per acre incentive through EQIP and a $13 per acre incentive through CSP programs. So if you have farmers that are in those programs and contracted, have them reach out to the NRCS staff to validate if you plug this in. Our understanding is you get those incentives back if the money is still on the table for that year. So that is our presentation for today. We have a couple other slides we could cover, but I think I know we wanted some time for questions, so we can stop here and go from there.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you so much. So we do have a couple of questions in the chat that I'm going to start off with, and if others on the call have follow-up questions or other questions you want to ask after this, you can come off mute and ask those if you'd like. But the first question that we have is back to your slide on the 4-year study. And how does the 4-year study, how do the economics or the return on investment work out on 0, 50, and 100%, I'm assuming, of the Rhizosorb? That's a Tim Hushin question. So Tim, if you want to clarify that at all, feel free to hop off of mute and do so.
Yeah, it was just in I think it was with the Penn State trials, you had showed the 4-year study showing the different rates of MAP applied and then the Rhizosorb applied as well. So just there really wasn't a huge yield swing in there. So I'm just curious how how those economics worked out.
Yeah, and that's always a problem, and we go back and forth on how to present that, because there's sometimes if you have a non-P responsive soil where you're going to have a 0P that actually is not too far off of the MAP or our product. With that said, what we've always pointed out is, like, look, if you're going to put down MAP, which most farmers will, because they're going to want to see the highest yield they can get off that farm, our product is going to be on average about 10% less per acre compared to MAP. Now, if you put 0P down, then you're going to have a cost reduction there, significant cost reduction. The question is whether the farmer wants to take the risk of whether they're going to have a year where you put 0P down and for some reason they get a hit on the yield. Brian, I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, Tim, thanks for the question. So what we see in the field is relative to MAP and DAP pricing is cost per acre to the grower, depending on the rate that's used currently. And there's a whole nother discussion we can have on how you make your P recommendation rates. But from a pricing and yield perspective, Rhizosorb is priced to the grower at about anywhere from a $4 to $10, $12 an acre savings to the grower, even if you are going to be equal in yield. So the growers have the opportunity to realize upfront cost per acre savings on their investments in phosphates for the coming season. And on the back end, a better than average chance on corn anyway. Our statistics show that, and our analysis shows that our win rate, if you will, on corn is about 86% of the time when you use Rhizosorb at the reduction we talked about and a cost savings up front, you're going to get a positive yield impact on the other side of it. And I give you that range because I had a grower out in my neighborhood in South Dakota that was asking me about some things, and based on his use rate and the calculations using his phosphate, his MAP pricing, we calculated everything out. And for him, it would have been about a $12 an acre savings because he was using a fairly high rate of MAP. So it is going to be variable. Growers will generally see a higher price per ton, but when you work it out on a per acre basis, which most growers eventually will work things out on a per acre basis to analyze their cost, they will see about that 10 to 15% range that Steve mentioned, and dollars and cents, $4 to $6, $7 an acre on an average. And by the way, you also you were mentioning maybe the 100% that you're referencing there is we don't generally recommend using Rhizosorb at a pound for pound basis, because in our studies, in our deeper scientific studies that we've done, we've gone everything from pound for pound way down to super low to try and find the sweet spot, if you will, for where Rhizosorb provides the greatest benefit, not only to the soil from a plant use efficiency standpoint, to the crop, and then also from the sustainability piece. And our objective here is to at least maintain what a grower's field average is for that particular crop for that year on his history.
Great,
Okay.
thank you.
Our next question is from Chris Hinder, and he would like to know if this product has been tested against other products in the space as far as phosphorus protection. And then he's also curious about the cost.
Steve, I'll take that, I guess. So Chris, help me understand. Are you referencing things like a veil or other phosphate additives to impregnate on dry fertilizer?
Yes, that was more or less what I was referring to.
Okay, so we are working on that. That is something that I've been directly involved in. And here's what I will say to that. When you're looking at an Avail type product or any of the other chelators or additives and micronutrient enhancers or efficiency products to put on a MAP or DAP, you can use that also on Rhizosorb, because here's what we're really talking about. We're talking about, from an Avail point of view, a slightly different mode of action that Rhizosorb brings to the table, that Avail will bring to the table. And I believe, let me see, I think I've got somewhere out in the marketplace today, I know I've got some phosphorus enhancement materials on Rhizosorb somewhere around the country. I can't think of where they're at right now, but think about it from a perspective of mode of action. Our primary mode of action is to help to increase the chemical gradient solution P to drive phosphorus to the plant. What an Avail type material is really designed to do, as I understand it anyway, is to help make the phosphorus applied become more efficient, while at the same time having some minimal impact on the biological systems of the soil profile to prevent's not the right word, but to suppress the tie-up effects and or the increase the positive release effects from your soil solution phosphorus from that fixed pool. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I just was curious, I guess. I didn't know if it was something that we should be looking at as far as a comparison, as far as use one versus the other or stack them, or but I think you kind of answered that as far as it's two kind of separate modes of action.
Yeah, I see it as a positive to continue to stack options that have been demonstrated scientifically and agronomically that will improve phosphorus use efficiency, so that we can address some of the issues and concerns that exist around the Chesapeake Bay and the Great Lakes from a runoff or a off-site movement, as I like to call it, of phosphorus.
So let me ask you this then. When you are planning to do these studies, maybe in the future, as far as stacking it, you're saying that with this product, you can essentially cut your rate by 50% with just the Rhizosorb product alone, if you add the Avail type technology to that, and they're, roughly, let's just say they're looking at 15% reduction in rate, would you add that on top of what so would you make that 65%?
If I understand your question, no, I would take your phosphorus your P rate that you desire to put down with Avail, and we would run through the calculation to provide you the recommendation application rate for Rhizosorb with Avail. And let me also clarify something for the call. Steve and I both talked extensively about a 50% P2O5 reduction in terms of product application rate per acre that is applied. On MAP basis, it's roughly about a 33% reduction in application of rate. So, for example, somebody has another question here about 100 pounds per acre. Let's just envision for a minute 100 pounds per acre of MAP that you apply to get 50 pounds of P2O5. Our application rate for Rhizosorb would be, I'll call it 66 to 70 pounds. Most people like to average up or round up a little bit. So say 70 pounds of Rhizosorb per acre will give you the same, if not better benefit than 100 pounds of MAP will in that same application. And now to your question, you can take those corresponding rates and add your Avail to it.
Thank you.
You betcha.
All
Next
right, so
question.
I'm not sure if Eric's question was just answered there, but he says if a farm applies 100 pounds per acre of Rhizosorb as a banded application at planting, does the active ingredient affect more than the 39 pounds of P included in the application?
We believe so. Our active ingredient isn't agnostic to just the P and that's in the granule itself, so it will grab P from the soil and use it, adsorb it and desorb it. But obviously the material that's immediately impregnated in the product is probably going to be the more readily used P from that standpoint. Brian, I don't know if you have anything to add to that. But
I think you covered it. We believe that there is some soil activity going on as the soil naturally cycles phosphorus, and then there's a anionic exchange rate in the mineral from the Rhizosorb. We believe anyway, we are capturing some of that soil phosphate to the mineral to be used later in the season for the crop. I forgot what I was going to say. I have had two growers independent of each other. One from Nebraska earlier this year, and one from Indiana. Both told me that they are in multiple years of using Rhizosorb at field scale, large acres. And when they took their soil test, and this goes to the soil STP conversation, when they took their soil test this year compared to their traditional areas, their soil test P levels went up, potentially meaning that there is enough cycling going on and mineral availability for capturing that phosphate to be used by the plant. And the yield, I happen to know the yield result on Nebraska, 2 different hybrids of corn where Rhizosorb was used versus DAP. He had an 11 bushel increase on one hybrid and a 13 bushel increase on the other. Are you going to get that every time? No. Traditionally speaking, our statistics show that everything that we've done shows about a plus or minus 2 to 2.5% positive response to Rhizosorb across all of our trials, 2 relative to grower standard practice. So we believe that you won't go backwards, but again, the $64 question is it going to rain?
So Amanda asks a question that is super relevant to a lot of our central Pennsylvania farmers, especially. What impact does or can this product have on fields that have P application restrictions due to high soil test levels? So we have a ton of fields with high phosphorus here just due to manure applications. So, how does the Rhizosorb, what are the potential positive impacts there?
You want to go, Steve, or you want me?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So in general, in the phosphorus discussion, phosphorus is inefficient, whether it's commercial P or manure. I will say this though, I have a lot of experience with manure applications as well. Manures are marginally better, more efficient than commercial phosphorus. So where you have been using a lot of manure and you're in some restricted areas for limited P use, and we also know or should know that manures are always and organic matter is always in a state of decomposition in order to get to the mineralized effect for plant use. Applying Rhizosorb, I believe, is going to have a positive impact on current year's yield in high phos situations where you are being regulated to a significant reduction due to high P levels. So as Steve showed a slide earlier where we have seen high testing soils, let's just say, I think the graph was greater than 40 parts per million. And I know some areas of where you all are at, you're even higher than that. But what's happening is the soil's efficiency for processing that phosphorus is not meeting plant demand and your levels keep going up. So you have to provide some sort of a system to provide current season availability for phosphorus, and that's where Rhizosorb can provide that benefit while at the same time helping to lower your phosphate P2O5 application that will begin over time to bring down your high P levels due to extensive manure applications.
Okay, I'm going to make one last call for your CCA or nutrient management certifications. If you haven't put a second entry in the chat, please do so now. And I'm going to just wrap up with a two-part question about supply and pricing. So Ben is asking about supply for the East Coast and what is the plan for that and the timing. And then Chris is asking about the price per ton on the product.
Okay, so availability, we are a distribution model. So we have representation. Our regional sales representative actually lives in Michigan and does cover Pennsylvania and New York. So he is currently in talks and communications with many retailers out east. So I would encourage you to talk to your local retailers about Rhizosorb. And if they don't know anything, please contact me if you want. Steve, if you want to type my email address in there,
Yeah.
you can. Contact me and we will get you in touch with the right individual to have those further conversations. We will have product. We do have product available for yet this winter if you're going to apply, but certainly for next spring. We're always in production processes and we will have product available. Regarding pricing, we do follow the MAP pricing model. So what you will generally see is Rhizosorb is priced at about a 30 to 35% premium to MAP. It does follow the market. So as I mentioned, it is higher price per ton, but the value that you get out of it is the reduction efficiency improvements for managing soils and crops, while at the same time helping to address the sustainability side of things. And it is cheaper in that neighborhood of $4 to $6 an acre on the average savings to the grower for equal to or better yield results statistically and year over year speaking. And I might add as a closing comment, I forgot to mention this regarding the banded. A lot of work that we have done in field scale trials has actually been done in strip till environments. The further east we go, there's more strip tillers. And we have had good reports come back from the growers that have done that in strip till situations, as they're very happy with it. It performed like they wanted to, or they expected. And some of those growers are involved with a group called Total Acre. Many of you on the East Coast probably know Randy Dowdy and David Hula. They're an intensive farm management consulting group that engage with a lot of growers seeking the next best edge for production and sustainability. So a lot of our work, we're directly engaged with them. We provide them the protocols. They do their work. They send everything back to us. We don't touch the data. And the data that they reported to us last year in 2023 was about a 76% positive return on investment and a positive return on yield.
Okay, well, we are at time. We have a couple more questions in the chat that we will follow up with this group of attendees by email to answer, because we do want to make sure that you get all of your questions answered. But Brian and Steve, thank you so much for taking the time to share about this with our group, and for also sharing your contact information for people if they have additional questions and can follow up. So thanks for attending, everybody, and have a great Wednesday.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. And yeah, definitely get us the